We take you live now to a news conference also at the National Press Club. A group of organizers want the U.S. to remove all military aircraft from the Syrian airspace, and they're hosting this briefing to talk about the U.S. military role in Syria.
Good morning and welcome to this news conference. My name is Norman Solomon. I'm a co-founder and coordinator of the online group rootsaction.org, which is hosting this event today. Roots Action is a co-sponsor of a petition campaign calling for, and this is the title of it, No U.S. Warplanes Over Syria. Together with 5 other organizations, Veterans for Peace, Daily Kos, The Nation Magazine, World Beyond War, and Watchdog.net. The U.S. government began bombing Syria nearly 3 years ago. That was back in September 2014. Since then, the killing from many sides has continued unabated. Meanwhile, during the last 3 years, tensions between the world's 2 nuclear superpowers have escalated, and escalated sharply. In the process, Russia and the United States have come closer to direct military warfare with each other. When addressing the overall tensions between the United States and Russia, former Senator Sam Nunn, who was chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, co-signed a letter recently, and I'd like to quote from it. It called for urgently pursuing practical steps now that can stop the downward spiral in relations and reduce real dangers, unquote, between Russia and the United States. And the open letter emphasized, again quoting, reducing nuclear and other military risks. Yet those risks continue to accelerate. That is the subject of this ongoing petition campaign, and that is the subject of our discussion here today. On June 19th, U.S. and Russian planes reportedly flew within 5 feet of each other over the Baltic Sea. Also, as this summer began, the U.S. military shot down a Syrian government jet, after which the Russian government threatened to shoot down U.S. planes over Syria. More recently, on July 30th, the New York Times reported that between the United States and Russia now, except for in relation to Syria, quote, there is virtually no military-to-military conversation of the kind that took place routinely during the Cold War. And the Times also said, with Russian and American forces both operating near the Baltics and off the coast of Europe, the chances for accident and miscalculation are high. The Times also described the communications between the Russian and U.S. militaries about their activities in Syria as, and quoting again here, mutually suspicious and sporadic. What's at stake here, as the United States continues its military actions in Syria, including in the skies over Syria, what is at stake includes the very real possibility that conflicts in the air could escalate into military clashes between Russia and the United States that could spiral into nuclear warfare. So the petition campaign that is ongoing is focused on addressing this escalating crisis. Our petition so far to the U.S. Congress and to Secretary of Defense James Mattis has gained more than 50,000 unique signers, and the petition is very straightforward. It says, we urge you to immediately remove all U.S. military planes from Syrian skies and keep them out of that country's airspace. Today at this news conference, we're going to be hearing from 4 speakers who will address their concerns, our concerns, from a wide range of vantage points. John Kirkiakou, former official of the Central Intelligence Agency, is a CIA whistleblower. Matthew Hoh was a Marine who had 2 deployments in Iraq and later became a State Department official. Christy Edwards is a legal authority on international law as it pertains to armed conflict. And David Swanson is an author and the director of the organization World Beyond War. So we'll start with John Kirkiakou. Mr. Kirkiakou, as I mentioned, was a CIA official. He had major responsibilities with the agency. He went on to serve 2 years in prison as a CIA whistleblower. Back in December of 2014, a headline over an article by the Huffington Post really summed it up, a very apt summary. It said, "The one man jailed for CIA torture tried to expose it." John Kirkiakou.
Thank you, Norman Solomon. President Trump, just like President Obama before him, seems intent on getting the United States involved in really what is an unwinnable civil war in Syria. Launching 59 cruise missiles, for example, against rundown Syrian air bases in the middle of the night is easy enough to do, but there are consequences to these actions. And Republican and conservative celebration at this use of force notwithstanding, Trump has put Syria's Christians and those Christians in neighboring countries in jeopardy, just as President Obama and President George W. Bush did in Iraq. Neoconservative and neoliberal ideologies took root in Washington many years ago. Both parties tried to out-hawk each other on military and foreign policy to prove who is tougher, who is stronger, who's quicker to use military force, even in countries where the U.S. has no obvious national or vital interests. There never seems to be any discussion about whether this military intervention is even legal, let alone whether it's moral or ethical. And there's certainly never any talk in Congress for authorization, despite the fact that the White House not requesting authorization is almost always a violation of the War Powers Act. Republicans' knee-jerk support for military intervention in the Middle East, whether it's in Syria, Iraq, or elsewhere in the region, ought to be anathema to any politician of either party who considers himself or herself to be a Christian. It is these military interventions that are having the effect of dooming the small Christian communities left in places like Iraq and Syria. The problem for U.S. politicians who fancy themselves as Christians, though, is that Bashar al-Assad is literally the only person standing between Syrian Christians and their annihilation. It is Assad, like his father Hafez, whether you like their politics or not, who have protected Syria's Christians for generations. Syrian Christians make up 12% of the population, according to the CIA's World Factbook. But nearly a third of the country's 600,000 believers have left Syria since the start of the civil war in 2011, pushed out by terrorist groups like ISIS and the Al-Nusra Front. And that's according to the New York Times. Before the civil war started, Christians participated in all elements, all aspects of Syrian society, including as members of parliament, as members of the cabinet, the diplomatic corps, and the business community. They maintain their own court system. They're free to practice their faith openly in churches and cathedrals all around the country. And even the Syrian military is fully integrated rather than having separate Christian units. Similarly, in Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, and Saddam Hussein was a bad man, but even under Saddam Hussein, Christians served in the parliament and the cabinet. They practiced their faith freely and openly, and they were successful in business. Thanks to George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq and the subsequent civil war there, almost the entire Iraqi Christian community has left for Jordan, the UK, and the United States. The same thing is now happening in Syria. There is a solution to all of this, but it's not sexy or quick or easy. It's something that many of us have heard about but haven't actually seen. It's called diplomacy. Whether Trump likes Assad's politics or not, the only way to save that country from becoming a failed state or an ISIS state is to sit at the table with all of the stakeholders, including the Syrians, the Russians, and whether we like it or not, the Iranians. We're going to have to accept the fact that Assad is not going anywhere, nor should he. Whether we like it or not, his is the internationally recognized government of Syria. And that is no matter what Trump and Obama have said. We should respect that, and we should sit across the table from Bashar al-Assad. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John Kirkiakou. Our next speaker is Matthew Hoh. Mr. Hoh is a former State Department official who resigned in protest from his post in Afghanistan over U.S. strategic policy and goals in that country. He resigned in September 2009. It's worth noting that the Council on Foreign Relations has cited his resignation letter as an essential document in the history of the war in Afghanistan. Prior to his diplomatic assignment, Mr. Hoh served 2 deployments as a Marine in Iraq. I should mention that Matthew Hoh, like John Kirkiakou, who we just heard, is on the advisory board of the Exposed Facts program at the Institute for Public Accuracy, which has been in this building here in the National Press Club facility for 18 years. And I'm the executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy. Here now is Matthew Hoh.
Thank you, Norman. I just want to begin my remarks by noting that we have a new chief of staff in the White House. And one of my concerns over these last many years of our campaigns, of our wars in the Middle East, of our what really is the most accurate way, our slaughter of many people in the Middle East, has been the misrepresentation and the misunderstanding of what drives many of the actors, many of the men and women who are fighting us in the Middle East. General Kelly has on numerous occasions stated that this is a war about our way of life. However, in my positions, particularly when I was in the State Department with access to top secret information and access to the interrogations of men that we would capture who had joined al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Islamic State in Iraq, it was clear that these men who were traveling to Iraq and Afghanistan to fight us, as well as what we know from those people who have carried out terror attacks in Europe as well as in the United States, including the 9/11 hijackers, in their martyrdom videos or in their notes or what have you. Their motivations are clear. They are not saying convert or die. They are not saying we hate your freedom. They are not saying we are doing this because your girls are going to school or because your women are wearing dresses above the knees. They are saying this. They are saying we are conducting these attacks because you are bombing our countries, because your militaries are present in our countries, because you're supporting dictatorships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there is this misunderstanding, this misconstruing. I think it's very intentional on some points. Some of it is based on ignorance, and much of it is done to drive nationalism and to drive the spirit of war. I will say this also ties greatly into what Norman was speaking about earlier, the dangers of a war between the United States and Russia. And of course, if anyone has been reading the New York Times recently, you will see the coverage in the New York Times over the large U.S. military exercises, the large NATO exercises being conducted on Russia's borders. We also remember Russia has been the victim of 3 major invasions in the last 150 years or so, losing tens of millions of people. However, the New York Times finds it fit to characterize Russia conducting military training within its own borders as aggression. So that is the first of my concerns that I'd like to address within my allotted time here about why it's so very, very important for us to get these American aircraft out of the skies of Syria, because we are on the brink of war with Russia. And it is something that I don't think the people in Washington, D.C. can quite understand what that war would be like. The second reason is more of a moral reason, and it's more of a reason that has got to do with the fact that simply that the United States air campaigns, the United States air warfare, may be, or in my estimation, is the greatest moral and human hazard of the last century. Certainly if you start with that this is the 72nd anniversary of the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, something that nearly all American 4-star and 5-star generals after World War II said was not a military necessity, was done for strictly political reasons. If you go into the understanding that most Americans do not know, but all North Koreans certainly know, that the American Air Force burned down nearly every village and town in North Korea, that in Vietnam we dropped more bombs on the Vietnamese than we did on the Japanese or on the Germans in terms of tonnage, and we conducted the largest chemical warfare program in the history of the world against the Vietnamese, something that millions of people are still sickened with, something that there will be babies born today with deformities because of. If we fast forward, of course, to the results of our air campaigns that the Iraqis certainly are still paying for, certainly that the Libyans are still paying for, that the Afghans are still paying for, and for which there has been no results that anyone can point to say this has been of benefit, then certainly how can anyone say that the air campaign being conducted by the United States is a sane, rational, or moral response? When I first started speaking publicly against the wars in 2009, I was asked, well, you've been in both, you served in both, you were in both, and I hate saying served, that's the incorrect word to use, I feel. You were in both Iraq and Afghanistan. What were the similarities? What were the differences between the two? And I fell into that trap. But then after a bit of time, I said, wait, what am I doing? There's only one thing that matters. The United States military is in both locations, and you can only expect one outcome. You're absolutely insane if you think anything different is going to happen. And that is the same thing that will happen with the American air campaign in Syria. If anyone thinks anything different will occur to the people of Syria from an American air campaign that's already been, as Norman noted, 3 years in progress, then they are completely naive, foolish, or have another agenda. And this is not to say that Bashar al-Assad has not been a dictator, does not come from, was not born from the father of a dictator, his father was not a dictator, has not committed war crimes himself. This is not to excuse that. I'm not here as an apologist for the Syrian government, but I am telling you that American airstrikes in Syria are not the solution and are a continuing moral hazard for all people of Syria, just as they have been for the people of Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Pakistan. And interestingly enough, if you've seen the news recently, the American military is now looking or is interested in launching airstrikes into the Philippines. So nearly 120 years after we first began our military campaign against the Filipinos, we are looking to continue it. So I appreciate you all being here today, and I thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Matthew Hoh. Our next speaker is Christy Edwards. At the American Society of International Law, Ms. Edwards is the chair of the Liber Society on the Law of Armed Conflict. She is an advisor to the Center for Civilians in Conflict on international humanitarian, human rights, and gender issues. Christy Edwards.
Thank you so much, Norman, for having me here. So I've been asked to provide the legal analysis for this topic, which is whether or not U.S. airstrikes violate international law based in Syria. So this is a really broad question, and I'm going to take a little bit of time to drill down into some more specifics and the international legal frameworks that apply in order to be able to answer this. So as I'm sure most of you are well aware, the UN Charter is the definitive legal framework that applies here. This is binding international law on the United States as a signatory. And Article 2.4 states that countries or states have an obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force against a territory or the political independence of any state. It seems like a pretty definitive prohibition, but there is, of course, an exception in Article 51, which states that states have a right of individual or collective self-defense. But if any state does use this exception, that any actions must then be immediately reported to the Security Council. So I'll look at two instances in the last few months to see how these legal principles apply. So, of course, April 6th, the attack on the chemical weapons, which occurred a few months ago. Now, the vast majority of legal experts all agree that the attack on April 6th violated the UN Charter and/or was unconstitutional for several reasons. One, there was no Security Council resolution authorizing the attack. The U.S. did not justify its actions based on self-defense. There was a statement released afterwards saying that this was done basically for humanitarian purposes based on how heinous the crimes committed by the Syrian regime were, these chemical attacks on civilians. And then in addition, of course, there was no authorization from Congress to use force in this circumstance. However, I think going against the majority of legal opinions that came out after this attack, former State Department legal advisor Harold Koh argued quite narrowly for a narrow affirmative defense for circumstances such as this based on necessity for humanitarian intervention. And he listed several criteria that would need to apply for this exception to take place, which I'm happy to refer you to if any of you would like that argument in more detail. But he did think that because of the circumstances in this case, that there should be a narrow exception in this case. So then, of course, as Norman mentioned earlier, the June 18th instance where a Syrian warplane was shot down by U.S. forces. And now here, the U.S. and Russia actually disagree about the facts and the law in this circumstance. So the U.S. claims that it acted in collective self-defense of coalition forces because the Syrian plane was bombing the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is one of the anti-Syrian rebel groups based in Syria. Now, Russia, however, says that the plane was providing air cover for Syrian ground forces who were fighting ISIS. So the U.S. action here violated Syria's sovereignty and international law, and thus constituted military aggression against the Syrian government. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, Article 51 does allow for collective self-defense of states, but not necessarily non-state armed groups like the SDF, or the Syrian Defense Forces. And just to be clear, the U.S. has not claimed that the SDF is a de facto organ of the United States. The U.S. is providing some support to the SDF, but it's not claiming that it's de facto organ of the U.S. under its direction and control. Now, my colleague Adil Haq has suggested perhaps a novel legal approach here, which says that the U.S. could use necessary and proportionate force to defend member states of the coalition and coalition non-state armed groups against ISIS if defeating ISIS was its sole mission. And that's a very narrow exception here. And of course, in the law, there's no right to collective self-defense of non-state armed groups for regime change or other political goals. Now, what makes it complicated here is that Secretary Tillerson and Ambassador Haley, on a couple of occasions, have indicated that the Syrian regime change remains a U.S. strategic objective. So here, the fact that there could be some mixed motives for both fighting ISIS, which is a strategic objective of the United States, and possible regime change, the mixing of these motives compromise the legal basis for military operations that have occurred and may occur here in the future. So I'll look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy Edwards. And our last speaker before we have questions from the journalists present is David Swanson. He's the author of several books on war, the director of the World Beyond War organization, and in addition, he's the campaign coordinator for rootsaction.org.
Thank you, Norman. And it's an honor to speak after these speakers. I won't have time to list all of the reasons I want U.S. military planes and drones out of Syrian skies, much less all the reasons people have noted in the comments on our petition, which you can read at rootsaction.org. But there is no question what my first reason is, although it is not a reason always given much weight here in Washington, D.C. These planes kill a lot of people. People all of equal value regardless of their religion or ethnicity. The U.S. military's casualty figures have such a record of error that I would trust them about as far as I could throw a Pentagon contract. Air Wars identifies thousands of civilian deaths from U.S. and allied planes, 4,734 to 7,337 in Syria and Iraq. And such counts generally turn out to be many times under the counts that comprehensive post-war studies arrive at. On top of which we have the problem of all the people killed who are not counted by virtue of not being labeled civilian. Always an empirically and morally iffy labeling process. Then there are the injuries that almost always outnumber the deaths, the homelessness, the extremely long-term effects of the U.S. use of depleted uranium by some of the planes we want out of those skies, the starvation that could have been prevented for a fraction of the cost of the planes, and of course the top killer of U.S. troops, suicide. The primary reason that what would otherwise be considered mass murder is given little heed is that it is understood to serve some higher purpose in both moral and legal senses. But what purpose is served by U.S. planes over Syria? If longer than most major wars of the past isn't long enough to figure that out, how about a purpose served by bombing Afghanistan, or Iraq, or Pakistan, or Libya, or Yemen? Apart from selling weapons and creating more enemies for the next war, what has been accomplished? Former CIA bin Laden unit chief Michael Schur says the more the U.S. fights terrorism, the more it creates terrorism. The CIA's own July 7, 2009 report called Best Practices in Counterinsurgency says drone killing is counterproductive. Admiral Dennis Blair, former director of national intelligence, says the same. General James E. Cartwright, former vice chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, says drone strikes could be undermining long-term efforts. Quote, "We're seeing that blowback. If you're trying to kill your way to a solution, no matter how precise you are, you're going to upset people even if they're not targeted," end quote. That is true whether or not the plane has a pilot in it. Maintaining the momentum of permanent war is obviously not a high moral purpose. Jody Rudorin in the New York Times on September 6 this past year reported that, quote, "For Jerusalem, the status quo, horrific as it may be from a humanitarian perspective, seems preferable to either a victory for Mr. Assad's government and his Iranian backers or a strengthening of rebel groups increasingly dominated by Sunni jihadists. This is a playoff situation in which you need both teams to lose, but at least you don't want one to win. We'll settle for a tie," said Alan Pincus, a former Israeli consul general in New York. Quote, "Let them both bleed, hemorrhage to death. That's the strategic thinking here, end quote. This endless war for war's sake may be done in the name of democracy, and you may be able to get television viewers to cheer momentarily for missiles launched from a ship which has almost the same problems as those launched from the air. But people in the very same polls that cheer for those missiles say the U.S. should get out of this war. Public pressure was key to preventing the start of a U.S. war, air war, in Syria in 2013. Never has the public or the Congress advocated for or authorized this war. It is a war destructive of the rule of law. Nowhere does the UN Charter or the Kellogg-Briand Pact permit this action from air, ground, or water. Special Operations Command Chief Army General Raymond Thomas 2 weeks ago admitted this was illegal. Claiming to defend U.S. troops in Syria against aggression by Syria is not a legal argument for defensiveness, but a declaration of lawless imperialism. And of course, stuff Harold Koh makes up isn't actually law. President Obama's decision to arm and train proxies was against the law, dramatically against public opinion, and against the report he had commissioned from the CIA on whether such efforts had ever succeeded in the past. President Trump's announcement that he will cease those efforts and henceforth fight on only one side of this war is a nod to reality, law, and possibly decency, given the account of his decision having followed his viewing of a video of CIA-backed fighters killing a child. But this war continues to kill children. This is all before mentioning the risk of apocalyptic nuclear confrontation with Russia as a result of Russia also fighting an immoral, illegal, and counterproductive war in Syria. That alone, as Norman described, is reason to remove every U.S. plane or drone. This is also without considering the environmental damage done to Syria and to our atmosphere. You can drive your car all year, feel guilty about it, but you won't pollute the sky like one flight of one of these planes. And then there's the financial cost. National Priorities Project puts the cost of the war on ISIS at $16 billion and counting, more than the UN says would be needed annually to have clean drinking water everywhere on earth, and more than half what the UN says it would take to end hunger not just in Syria, but globally. And this war serves as the top public justification for military spending that adds up to about $1 trillion a year in the United States. That choice of how to spend our resources kills more people than all current wars put together because of where that money is not spent. A fraction of that spending could be invested in diplomacy, aid, disarmament, and unarmed peacekeeping to far better effect. These alternatives have been available since day one and still are. The United States spent years sabotaging UN attempts at peace in Syria. According to former Finnish President and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Martti Ahtisaari, the United States dismissed out of hand a Russian peace proposal for Syria in 2012. The U.S. ruined last year's ceasefire by firing on Syrian troops. Nothing is going to quickly bring peace and prosperity to Syria, but continuing to do what we know makes matters worse has to end. We have to give peace a chance. Thank you.
Thank you, David Swanson. We're now going to have a question and answer session. We do have a live microphone here for the journalists present. So when you do ask your question, please give your name and identify your news outlet. And who would like to go first? There must be a question here somewhere. I think I'm seeing a hesitant. Yes, is that it? Okay. And here comes the microphone. Please go ahead. Go ahead. I think you're being heard.
All right. Hello?
Yes, please go ahead.
It's for the TV camera. This is Ahmed Hazim from RT Arabic, and I have a question for Mr. John Kirkiakou. And my question is regarding that Assad is the only one person standing between Christians and annihilation, as you mentioned. But I'm from the region, I'm from there, and Christians have been living there for centuries now. Well, more than 2,000 years ago. Actually, Christianity has been created there. Why do you think that only now they are facing annihilation? Why they didn't face it before? They survived more horrible rulers than Assad.
Oh yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think that Christianity has done very well in Syria under Assad. His politics aside, I'm not necessarily a fan of Bashar al-Assad. I think that he's a dictator. I think he's an anti-democrat. But the truth is that with the players that are on the field now, he's the one that gives the Christians the best chance of having a thriving community. If you look at the alternatives, never minding the notion that the United States promotes that somehow magically this is all going to come together and everybody's going to live in peace and harmony. That's just simply not going to happen. So what are the alternatives? The alternatives are ISIS or the Nusra Front or some Al-Qaeda related organization or Assad. And of those choices, I think those are the realistic choices. Of those choices, the best is Assad. Now, time was, maybe as recently as 2012 or 2013, where there was talk of perhaps a Syrian military junta pushing Assad aside. There was the same talk in Iraq through the 1990s, that the best and the most likely alternative to Saddam Hussein was a group of Sunni Iraqi generals. It hasn't happened. And so of the choices that I think the community is facing now, their best bet is with Assad.
I just follow up a question very quickly. I have told that for the cameras too. And I guess it's working now, or not. But the Syrian conflict, the Syrian crisis, have been now going for more than 6 years, and it's much more complicated to look at it from one perspective or one angle, which is minorities, which is a very, very serious one, though. But killings have been the headline of any community, majority or minority. So how I can justify, for example, for the Sunnis, that you're killing now in Homs, in Hama, in Halab, and all that, was to preserve the Christian community.
Oh,
this is,
no,
just one more. This
Sure.
is an argument for them.
Sure.
For them will be so unfair.
You're exactly right. And I think you're misunderstanding my comments. My comments were aimed at neoconservative and neoliberal Democrats and Republicans in Washington who think that anybody is better than Assad, that Assad is the problem in Syria, that we cannot achieve peace with Assad still in power in Syria. It was to them that I was directing my comments. You're exactly right. You can't go to the Sunni community and say that the deaths in their community are less important than in any other community. Same in the Kurdish community. I don't think that any deaths are any less important than any others. It's just that my comments were really geared toward Capitol Hill more than anything else.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Priya Reddy from RT America News.
Oh, sorry, wait for the mic if you would.
Hi.
Thank you.
Okay. My name is Priya Reddy from RT America News. Thank you all for your very powerful and thoughtful comments this morning. Regarding the mixed motives that were mentioned that compromise the legal basis for the U.S. interventionism in Syria, you mentioned a couple of arguments that undermine the claim of humanitarian intervention, such as regime change goals and fighting ISIS, perhaps. I wanted to ask, would you or any of you consider the U.S. allyship or partnership with Saudi Arabia, sort of a notorious human rights abuser, but with regard to Syria, as also something that might undermine the humanitarian motive claim. So that's one question. And the other one was, does the removal of Assad, if that were to happen, a lot of people have expressed fears of seeing another Libya or an Iraq or a vacuum that could be filled with people worse than Assad. Is that something that you could speak to? Or, thanks.
I hope others will answer the questions as well. These are good questions, but I would just point out that when the U.S. participates in war in Yemen in partnership with Saudi Arabia, it violates not only the UN Charter and the Kellogg-Briand Pact, but also the U.S. law called the Leahy Law, which says you can only support another nation in mass murder when that other nation does not violate human rights. And how you conduct mass murder without violating human rights, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't answer that for you, but that is an additional way in which U.S. operations in Yemen are illegal. On top of which, you get into this question in Yemen of, well, can an exiled dictator create legality by inviting other nations to attack his country, right? So when Donald Trump is impeached and removed and living on his private island and he invites China to bomb Washington, D.C., I mean, we would all accept that as legitimate, right? No, it's nonsense. These are nonsense arguments for war, just as the argument for Russia's actions in Syria being legalized by the Syrian government. There is nothing in the UN Charter or the Kellogg-Briand Pact or any basic understanding of morality that says war is okay if a dictator asks you to help with it. So, the U.S. is committing a crime in Syria, so is Russia.
Sure. Well, I think certainly, yeah, your concerns about the removal of Assad and in the vacuum, you've certainly seen that in Libya, other locations. As far as relationship of the United States to Saudi Arabia, oh yeah, the hypocrisy is there's lots of slang I could use back I'm from New Jersey. There's lots of slang and curses I could throw at you to describe that type of level of hypocrisy. I mean, we provide the fuel and the bombs, the intelligence that allows Saudi Arabia to commit those atrocities in Yemen, let alone what Saudi Arabia is like anyhow in terms of its own internal human rights violations. Lots been made in the last week of the attacks on, and excuse me, but I can't recall the name of the city that Saudi Arabia is. Medea, do you know? Almeida, yeah, that's Saudi Arabia is attacking internally. So yes, but hypocrisy has always been first and foremost in American. I mean, come on, you go back to the American Constitution. I mean, equality was only for white male property owners. You know what I mean, there's never been, this real standard of non-hypocrisy in American speech and thought and political, ideology anyway. So there's always been hypocrisy in everything America has done. And so this notion of talking about Syria, but then coordinating with Saudi Arabia, particularly too with going back to, it was brought up before about this notion of sabotaging efforts in 2012 in Syria. That's about the same time too that we were utilizing via Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia their efforts with groups such as Nusra and the Islamic State to try and overthrow the Assad government. The notion that we could try and use those groups for our purposes in Syria while trying to keep them at bay within Iraq. This is how the United States government operates. And we know all this because of declassified Defense Intelligence Agency reports. So not only are we hypocritical, but we're also bipolar in many ways, because we think we can not just be two-faced, but we think we can also manage certain situations in a way that just defies reality. And of course, coming back to it all, it's the very people who live in these places who are being burned to death and ripped apart. And I think it's very easy for us to forget that as we talk about this, as I stand here in my suit and tie, and drink my cup of coffee and everything, that as we speak about this, American bombs are ripping apart men, women, and children as we speak. So it's not abstract at all. Yeah.
Actually, that's one thing I forgot to mention was that, I'm sorry, just a number of people mentioned the reliance on airstrikes as a big part of U.S. strategy. Would that also not undermine, will the resulting war crimes not undermine the humanitarian pretext argument as well? That was the final part of my question I left out.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the other thing too is I recall there being a report that was released by the United Nations last fall, and I was reminded of this yesterday by a colleague about our sanctions on Syria. And the United Nations reported that our sanctions on Syria and the EU's sanctions on Syria, the effect it has on the Syrian population, and how deadly those sanctions are, because those sanctions prevent the pharmaceuticals, the medical supplies, the foodstuffs, the things that people need to survive, let alone the things that hospitals need, the things that, so yes, this notion that we are somehow involved for humanitarian means, but that's all nonsense. You don't have to look much farther than go back a couple weeks to the Washington Post, where Michael Vickers, who has been in the CIA and the Department of Defense for a long time, he was involved in he was very much involved in the American efforts in Afghanistan in the 1980s against the Soviet Union. But very clearly in that op-ed that Washington Post ran, he states that in Syria, in the Syrian civil war, we saw an opposition to strike a blow against Iran by removing Assad to cut off Iran's relationship with Hezbollah. So this is a very senior American official who's been in both Republican and Democratic administrations. They may talk about humanitarian reasons, but for many, many, many people in the national security positions in Washington, D.C., as well as politicians, what they do, what they see, and I've seen this, I was fortunate to be in senior positions in Washington, D.C., in both the State Department and the Pentagon. For many of these people, it is like a game of Risk. They look at the map and they want to turn different countries the colors they want to turn them. And you can see that in Vickers' column in the Washington Post from a couple weeks ago. Very clearly, they want to turn different colors, different countries, different shades. And that's how these people view the world and how they view it. There's anything they say about humanitarian reasons, that's just good PR. That's just a smart way to address it, a smart thing to say. Yeah.
I just also wanted to address some of the legal frameworks that apply here. So when we talk about human rights law, the right to life, which is embodied in the UN Charter and every human rights treaty basically created, the right to life is inviolable. It's one of the major themes of human rights law. Now, when we're talking about international humanitarian law, which is what governs how war is conducted, whether or not the war was illegal to begin with, or how we got into the war, whether those circumstances were correct or not, in international humanitarian law, there are humanitarian principles that do apply. So although the right to life under human rights law is the norm and the standard, it is allowable under international humanitarian law to kill, and to even kill. You cannot target civilians, but civilian deaths are allowable. Now, in order for civilian deaths to be allowable, there has to be a very, very strict analysis of distinction, proportionality, military necessity. And so there's this calculus that goes on. What's your military objective? And can you achieve that military objective? And can you achieve it with the least amount of civilian deaths possible? And so that's what military commanders are responsible to do every time they commit any military action. Now, if they have other justifications besides military necessities, such as humanity, that's also absolutely necessary. But what we're looking at, and what many organizations are looking at, is the United States and any other actor that's acting in this context. Are they doing everything that they possibly can to eliminate completely, or to cause the fewest amount of deaths in any action that they take? So I hope that answers your question.
We have a few more minutes for questions. Yes, please, go ahead.
By default, I have the microphone.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Jafar Jafari. I'm with Al Mayadeen TV network. I truly enjoyed the presentations, and I commend the panel for focusing on the military aspect of the U.S. strategy in the Middle East. I believe that the narrative should be refocused on the entire U.S. strategy in the Middle East, per se, and that is it's engendered in regime change. Now, only last week, Secretary Tillerson got up in front of the State Department and clearly stated that the U.S. is no longer seeking regime change in North Korea. Well, if that is true, that is truly commendable. However, if it's okay in North Korea to maintain current regimes, but it's not okay to maintain the current regime in Syria, why should it be the U.S. business anyway to change regimes? And I think this is the narrative that people are looking for. It's not just the aspect of the defined policy, which is implemented through war in the Middle East, whether it's Syria, whether it's in Iraq, Afghanistan, or other areas. But it's the U.S. policy of regime change that has brought us to, through several conflicts, to the stage. Thank you.
Well, very briefly, I agree with you 1,000%. No one has given the U.S. legal authority to decide the fate of other nations by any means. And since World War II, the United States has interfered, as we know, in at least 82 foreign elections, though not in the bad Russian way, presumably, and bombed over 30 countries. This is, no one appointed the U.S. to this role. This is not illegal. This is not enforcing law. This is violating law. And so it has to end. And the U.S. public is not the driving force here. And the U.S. public put Donald Trump in the White House after he campaigned against this practice and said, we're done with overthrowing governments. And to whatever extent he starts to actually abide by that, so much the better. But it ought to become unacceptable in the U.S. To continue down that road. And I would just add that when this discussion of killing as few people as possible in the process, when the United States military says bombing that spot where ISIS stores its money is worth up to 50 civilian deaths, that's not actually fewest possible. That's naming a pretty large number, and there's nothing whatsoever empirical about it. I can't go back and say, well, I studied and it's actually only 45 civilian deaths. No, it's actually 308 civilian deaths. It's not empirical. It's just rhetoric, and it's immoral and it's illegal, and the world didn't ask for it. And the Pew study last week of 38 countries found that the majority of them viewed the United States, more than Russia and more than China, as the biggest threat, including places like Turkey and South Korea and Japan. And a Gallup poll of a few years back had similar results. The U.S. the biggest threat of any country to peace in the world. So the global policing is not appreciated by the people being policed, and it ought to end.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Please identify yourself and your question. Thank you.
I have two questions. One is political for these guys, and the other one is humanitarian for you. My first question is, yes, wars are bad. Wars are killing people. And you don't want the U.S. To intervene in other countries' domestic policy. Okay, but Syria is like a chessboard. And wars are reality. And the international relations are another reality. And if one day U.S. Takes its aircraft from Syria, don't you think that the United States will lose its ground in Syria about international policy or international relations and leave the space to Russia, to Iran, and to the other powers?
That's a hard question, but I'll preface this by saying that I'm not an attorney. You are, but I'm not. But it's my understanding that legally, if the internationally recognized government of Syria invites another country to come and help it, that other country is there legally. The Russians have been invited by the Syrian government. The United States has not been invited by the Syrian government. Now, I'm all for humanitarian assistance if we can provide medicine or humanitarian relief, food, water, even safe passage out of the country for refugees. That's great. But it's my understanding that anything more than that, at least at this point in Syria, is illegal. We're supposed to be a nation of laws in this country. We like to tell people, we like to tell other countries that we're this shining beacon of respect for human rights and civil liberties and the rule of law and democracy, and it's just simply not true. It's rhetoric, it's propaganda. So if we were serious about this being true, we would live that policy, and we don't. We just want other countries to live it.
But do you think that if U.S. takes its aircraft from Syria, do you think that Russia and Iran takes their soldiers from Syria also?
Oh, no, I don't think so at all. No. Realpolitik is real. But no, I don't think so at all. I'm not sure that that's really, though, the most important thing to worry about in this scenario. I think that there are bigger issues of respect for human rights and civil liberties and peace in the region.
And do you want to add something on this issue as a former State Department official?
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is this. Look, the United States has been heavily involved in the Middle East for 7 decades now. About 5 or 6 years ago, Princeton University did a survey or a study. They found that since Jimmy Carter's presidency, the United States had spent $10 trillion policing the Persian Gulf region. And I would say that in my lifetime, nearly every country from the edge of the Mediterranean Sea through Afghanistan, with the exception, no, that's not true, including Iran, has been destroyed. Every city has been razed to the ground, more or less, in my lifetime. I was born in 1973. And that's with the United States having spent $10 trillion in the region, having had a massive military presence. I see no reason why the United States should remain in the world, in that region. It has provided no help to anybody in the region and has wasted vast amounts of sums of American money, wasted, and millions of people are dead. So I see no value in it. And I can't see any explanation for how, or any reason for how things would have been better or I'm sorry, how things would have been worse if we had not been there. So that's my way I view it. As far as whether or not, if we're not there, if the Iranians are there, or the Russians are there, the Chinese are there, or the Portuguese are there, or the Finnish are there, or I don't know, that's speculation. All I know is what has occurred and what is occurring. And I know that the American military is responsible for so much of it. And that's where that's how I view it. So.
And second question. I have a second one.
Yeah, we're unfortunately out of time. I know many of all the speakers are available to talk one-on-one with the journalists here. I'd like to thank everyone for participating and attending today, and to emphasize that the petition campaign called No U.S. Warplanes Over Syria is continuing. Anyone can sign and participate and be part of the national campaign by going to the web, by visiting rootsaction.org. That's rootsaction.org. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank all 6 organizations who've made this a nationwide and really international campaign. rootsaction.org, Veterans for Peace, Daily Kos, The Nation Magazine, watchdog.net, and World Beyond War. Thank you all for being here.
We're doing a protest by the